Hey there, thanks for joining me today. This is Laura Lynn with Keep Inking Up. I'm an independent demonstrator for Stampin' Up in San Antonio, Texas. And today's the first video in a series of videos that I'm making about embossing folders. I love to use embossing folders because they add a lot of texture to my projects without a lot of effort. But I did want to share a couple of tips and tricks, but I didn't want the videos to get too long, so I am going to cut it up into smaller videos to make it a little easier to understand. So today's video, I'm going to be talking about the Pretty Flowers embossing folder, which is one of our standard embossing folders. So you can tell it's quite flexible, and it's a thinner embossing folder as opposed to our 3D embossing folders, which I'll talk about in future videos. So this is a beautiful embossing folder that has a lovely floral pattern, which I use quite a bit. So to use any standard embossing folder in our Stampin' Cut and Emboss machine, you're going to use the #1 base plate. You're going to need a #3 cutting plate. This one's well loved, as you can tell. And then you're going to use your embossing folder with your piece of cardstock in it. And a lot of our folders, not all of them, but a lot of them, you'll notice there'll be a line on here. And this is to help you make sure that your paper is straight in your embossing folder, which really comes in handy, especially with the folders that have a directional pattern, to make sure that it stays nice and straight. You'll put that on top of the cutting plate, and then you'll add one more #3 cutting plate and run this through your Stampin' Cut and Emboss machine. Now, what I do like to recommend is that you always face the hinge of your embossing folder, whether it's a standard folder or whether it is a 3D folder. I suggest that you place the hinge in the direction of the rollers when you're putting it into your embossing machine. I recommend against sending it in this manner because I have had sometimes my hinge then get kind of chewed up as it goes through the machine, and I've ruined some folders that way. So to save you from my mistakes, or to help you learn from my mistakes, I do recommend that you send the hinge always toward the rollers in your machine. Okay, so what happens when you run through cardstock is you'll get something like this. This is our Tahitian tied cardstock. I think it's a beautiful color. And you can see that this is the embossed side of the flowers. You could also maybe choose to use the debossed side. That's a lovely look as well. It's your choice. You can use either side. But you do not need to be limited to only using cardstock. And that's what I wanted to focus on in this particular video. You do not need to limit yourself. So what else could you use? Well, you could use window sheet. Now I know this is kind of hard to see, especially with my lights. I just get a lot of glare, and I apologize for that. But this is a really cool look as well with the embossed or debossed side. And I think this would be very interesting on maybe a shaker card. So you could have the shaker bits behind it, but it's still decorative. There's still a lot of texture, a lot of interest. So I think it's a very interesting look. So don't forget about window sheet. And actually this window sheet is from, it's a recycled piece from my stamp sets. When I get my photopolymer stamp sets, there comes a piece of the acetate. And so this is actually that. So it's a good way to recycle material as well. So that is something else you could do. You could also use vellum. What I love about using cardstock vellum is how the white shows up on the pattern. As the embossing folder presses through the cardstock, the vellum cardstock, it produces this white edge. And isn't that lovely? I think that is just a beautiful, beautiful look. It's very soft, very subtle, very elegant looking. So I think this is another great option to use with embossing folders. And finally, my sample, I have a piece of Designer Series paper. So this is the Sweet Sorbet Designer Series paper. It's a very subtle pattern that I used on this particular one. And I did go ahead and use my blending brushes and added a bit of ink over it so you could really see the embossed image a little bit stronger. You can tell it's not as noticeable on this side because I did not add the ink. But this side I did, and so it kind of pulled it out a little bit more. So I do have a card sample where I used another piece of Designer Series paper. This is actually a retired pattern, but it actually lined up exactly with the embossing folder, with this particular Pretty Flowers embossing folder. But isn't that pretty? And so you can see that I used a large piece of it in the background for this card. So anyway, today's video, I wanted to share how you can use your embossing folders on a wide variety of materials. Thank you so much for joining me for this particular video, and in the future videos, I will share more tips and tricks on different techniques that you can use with your embossing folders. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the future videos. Bye-bye.